Welcome, everyone. I know I look like I'm eating, but this is my microphone. I am Laura from Transition Town, Jericho, and Dave Clift is here as well representing our group. We've been around pretty much since 2017. At this point, very devoted to these public education talks. Sometimes these talks lead to action. That's what we're always hoping for. And a few years ago, a lot of people in the town seemed to be interested in localization of food. And through a process, we've helped get the Jericho Underhill Food Hub going. So the Transition Town, and actually though some of this talk will focus a bit on localization of food. So there's always the potential for where these talks can go. We're very action-oriented. And at this point in time in the world, individual efforts can only go so far. Waiting for national politics can be frustrating. And so we're very devoted to what change can we make at the town level. So thank you all for coming. Our presenter tonight is Josh Farley from UVM. The Community Development, Applied Economics is his department. He's part of the Gund Institute. And actually, Josh and I years ago worked together on local currency in Burlington. A whole big topic there. So thank you, Josh. I'll let you finish the intro and take it from here.
All right. Thanks. All right. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, and the only other thing I'll add is I'm an ecological economist. So I was trained as a mainstream, neoliberal economist, and within my first semester realized it was based on bad science and worse ethics and wasn't for me. But then I discovered ecological economics, which I'll give a little bit of an introduction to, and then some of the ways we try to apply it. And this talk it's kind of stitching together a lot of things I've been thinking about lately and doing lately. So it's hopefully it remains coherent and relevant to transition towns, which I've been super interested in since I heard of them. So, the title, Rethinking Economics, Evolution, Rethinking Economics, so it's Evolution, Community, and Transition Towns. One of my students actually started up the Rethinking Economics group at UVM, and so it is a worldwide movement. We're one of the first ones in the US really challenging the way our economy works. So first of all, just a question for all of you. What economic system are all you raised in? So what do people say? So capitalism, that's what, and this is what, when I ask this question to my students, they always tell me, oh yeah, capitalism, neoliberalism. And I say, oh, your parents charge you room and board. And no, because all of us almost were raised in what's called the core economy or the caring economy, or this economy based on reciprocity and love and gifting, totally different values, totally different principles. One of the things I always think is very interesting in a caring economy based on gifting and reciprocity, if somebody gives you something really nice and you've only given them something kind of mediocre, you think, oh man, I really have got to reciprocate. I've got to, you feel bad if you get more than you're given. In a market economy, oh, I just got this thing 80% off, knowing that there was exploitation of people and nature involved, you feel good nonetheless. It's just a really weird dynamic. So we have this, what I think is the really important, what I really do call the core economy. It's in what we're raised in. It's the, economy based on gifting and sharing and reciprocity. And then we have the market economy. And then we have what I would call the, you could call it the macro economy or the public purpose sphere, which is how we deal with collective action problems. So we have the, the government provides Social Security, has all sorts of, builds the roads, there's all sorts of collective action problems solved by government, another part of the economy. And what I'm gonna make the case is what we're desperately missing is a part of the economy that reflects our interactions with a natural system that sustains us all. And this is what we don't have any economic institutions. And this is what we desperately need. And I'll lay this out in much more detail. And I believe there's really strong evolutionary foundations for this, for the need for this, for all of these parts of the economy. But actually what's missing is this, our interactions with nature. So I often start out, what is economics? And also I should say, anybody has questions, feel free to interrupt, comments, just make it like, because I'll talk, but please interrupt if you want. So the conventional definition of economics is the allocation of scarce resources among alternative desirable ends. And this is like, this is how they talk about market economics. And interestingly, if you take a class in economics, they'll give you this definition, but what they say, we're only going to focus on markets. So they're talking about the allocation, but in my view, if you have this definition, the very first question you have to ask is, what are the desirable ends? If you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. And this is almost entirely ignored by mainstream economics courses. And then once you've figured out what your desirable ends are, then you figure out, well, what are the scarce resources required to achieve them? And then, well, they always talk about scarce resources, but like, what do you think economists mean by scarce? What is something that's scarce?
Not abundant, limited.
It's limited and it's not abundant, there's not enough to go around. Basically what it means, there's not enough to go around. And really what this translates to in economics is my use leaves less for others. But we live in an information economy right now. And no matter how much we use ideas, no matter how much I share my ideas with you, I share them with you because they come back better. They get improved upon. So knowledge, the more it's used, the better it gets. It's the opposite of scarce. We live in an information, a knowledge economy, and yet we have this mindset that we're dealing with, only scarce resources. And I think some resources really are scarce. If we use forests to build houses, we don't have those forests to provide all these vital life support functions. Scarcity is real, but it's not only scarce resources we care about. And there's a lot of resources that basically my use doesn't leave less for others. And market economies have a terrible job managing those resources. But once you've asked these other questions, only your final question is, how do we allocate? And the irony is when you take any class in economics almost anywhere in this country, they're going to start right out with, we use markets to allocate. Markets are the answer. Now what's your question? And I actually think that there's many, many different ways we can allocate resources, including those ones I showed on the previous slide, and we have to pay attention to that. I actually vastly prefer this other definition of economics, and this will become clear through the course of this presentation, but how we interact with nature and society to satisfy our material needs. The role of an economy is provisioning. It's meeting our basic needs, and we humans are inherently social. As individuals, we're dead. If you did not have, if you think about how many different people from around the world were required to create, your shirt. And then also if you think about the knowledge that was embedded in creating this shirt, it's billions of people over thousands of years to create the knowledge to make this shirt. We cannot live apart from that. So everything we do is interaction with society, and every resource we have, all the places we get our energy, our raw material, where we dump our waste, it's all nature. So there is the only way we can meet our material needs is by interacting with each other and with nature. And I'll elaborate on that more. So how are we doing on that? How are we how are we doing interacting with, society and nature to meet our material needs? Most of you have seen this, I don't know how many of you have seen this donut economy idea. And the idea is that the outer circle is the planetary boundaries. These are ecological domains that if we exceed some boundary, we risk catastrophic impacts on the whole system. And of these nine areas they've identified and researched, we have exceeded 7 of them. This figure came out this year, but it came out before they had done the work on, this says air pollution. It's often talked about novel entities. It's the chemicals we dump. And they've said we have exceeded the safe boundaries for all of, 7 out of 9 of these things we're looking at. Ocean acidification we've probably exceeded, and the ones that we haven't exceeded, sometimes they're just not studied enough. So on the ecological side, how we're interacting with nature, we're doing a terrible job. We're threatening the life support functions that sustain us all in a profound way. And then the other side is how we interact with each other. This is the social foundation. These are the things that all humans need, food, water, health, education, energy, etc. And this is how far short we're falling of providing the basic necessities for a decent life. And so, the big point is that we are doing a terrible job meeting social needs and meeting ecological needs. and we really have to rethink how we're managing the economy. Basically the economy is failing us in deeply profound ways. And so mainstream economics, so there's, I don't know how many of you know the work of Donella Meadows, who was, not too far from here, over at Dartmouth, and she was a systems thinker, and she said, if you want to change a system, there's 3 really powerful levers. And one is changing the paradigm, essentially the worldview, how you understand the world. Another is changing the goals, and another is changing the rules. And so this is what I see is what really needs to be done for our economic system. So I'm just going to quickly go through in mainstream economics. It's often called neoclassical economics or, market economics. It's what's taught in 99.9% of the courses in universities in the US. And its basic paradigm, how it views the world, there's a biophysical paradigm. What's the biophysical nature of reality? And this chart, this doesn't mean much to you, but this shows output, input. This is the production function. You could look up an economic production function. Just Google that and you'll see tons of these. And what it says is output, what we produce, Y, is a function of capital and labor. No raw materials, no energy, no waste emissions. Nature, it's just completely separated from nature. And our economic theories, we really are taught that nature is not, in fact, when they've interviewed economists to ask, how much does nature contribute to our economic well-being? They'll say 1 or 2% of our well-being comes from nature. And it's a really bizarre idea. So the one big point I wanted to point out here is that only capital and labor. Nature's really not involved. But the other thing that's interesting is it shows here's your output, here's your input. As you add more inputs, your output goes up at a decreasing rate. So this is the story they tell, that for any firm, the more it produces, the more it costs to produce an additional unit. Which is, if any of you think about that, I start my introductory class, I ask the students, what happens to firms as they get bigger, as they produce more? What happens to the cost of producing another unit? Does it go up or does it go down? 100% of the students say it goes down. Because of course, it actually does in reality. But for an economist, you have to say it goes up, because we're making a case for a perfectly competitive market economy. Thousands of firms producing the same thing, competing with each other. If the cost of production went down as you produce more, then you'd have one firm producing everything for us, one firm for each thing. So what you'd expect in that kind of economy is a handful of gigantic trillion-dollar corporations that kind of control most of the economy, which, lo and behold, is what we actually see. But if you admitted that, you would have to say that, gosh, perfect competition, first, we don't have the conditions for that to work. So anyway, I don't want to go on at length about that. I'm working on that a lot right now. But so one of these big things, though, the major point here is that nature is not a part of our economy. And then they always show this other thing. And again, this is that same thing. This is the supply curve. The cost of production, the more you produce, the more it costs to produce an additional unit, which is total nonsense, especially in an information economy. It costs a huge amount of money to develop an operating system for a computer. It costs 2 cents to put it on the next computer. So that your costs actually go down. But what I wanted to show here just is that the assumption is that our economy goes towards equilibrium. It just goes towards a balance. And this comes from, when the economists were coming up with these ideas, this was the 18th century. And the model of science was Newtonian physics, where everything goes to equilibrium. And if you take a photo of, or you take a film of, hard to take a film this big, but super sped up, of the moon going around the Earth, or the sun, or the Earth going around the sun, you show it in forward or reverse, it looks the same. And if you have a pendulum, forward or reverse, it looks the same, things go to equilibrium. This was the world, this was our best understanding of science, was these systems that go to equilibrium, that go the same in forward and reverse. That's what economics is modeled after. Since then, we've actually learned whole huge new fields of science, thermodynamics, that things change, that when you burn a match, you can't light the same match twice. There's certain things, if you watch a film in reverse of a bomb dropping, you show it in reverse. It's not this, I love that Kurt Vonnegut explained how wonderful that would be if, all these showing bombs in reverse, where this thing just sucks up all this damage and restores it, and then it goes back in a plane to where women disassemble it and then inter the stuff in the earth. But so the point being is mainstream economics is based on equilibrium systems that naturally go towards a static point, when in reality we know our economies are very far from equilibrium. We get these bubbles and busts, but I don't want to go too much here. And then the final thing is, on this biophysical paradigm, is what's the goal of, what do most economists say the goal is of our economy? Like how do we say the economy is doing well? Growth. It's growing and growing and growing, and what they say is, well, there is this problem that we have these negative externalities. There's these external costs that we're ignoring. So what we need to do, and that harm to nature is an external cost, so what we need to do is put prices on everything, and then we can internalize nature into the economy, and then the economy can grow forever, balancing everything. So the economists explicitly say that nature is part of the economy that provides raw materials and handles some of our waste, but the economy can grow forever, meaning the economy is the whole, because there's no subsystem can grow indefinitely within a finite system. So these are, this is kind of the biophysical paradigm of economics, but there's a social paradigm. I don't even know if social is the way to say it for economics, but it's how do people behave. And in economics, the social paradigm is what they call methodological individualism. All that matters is the individual. There's no such thing as society. We are atomistic, totally self-interested individuals who really only interact with other people for our own self-interest and for these, some kind of beneficial exchange. But so it comes out with this idea of the economic man, how a person is that they're perfectly self-interested, just don't care about the way economists would say is, your utility functions don't enter in my utility function. So nothing that happens to you matters to me. And it says totally rational, has unchanging preferences, and always want to maximize utility. But utility in mainstream economics is measured by money. The idea is utility is this how do I know how much benefit you get from something? I can't get in your brain and know how you're thinking. What I can do is observe your preferences based on your purchases. So we know that what you buy gives us utility. Therefore, we use money as a measure of utility. So the more money you have, the more utility you have. So that's the paradigm. And then the goals of economics is, they always talk about efficiency, 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 by which we mean maximizing monetary value. So what's the efficient use of a loaf of bread? Should you give it to the destitute woman trying to feed her hungry children, or to the overfed person who's going to throw 40% in the garbage? What maximizes utility from the mainstream economist framework, who's going to pay more for that? If the rich person is willing to pay more, that maximizes utility, that maximizes GDP, and that's literally what they say. So the efficiency is monetary value, allocating resources to their highest and best use as measured by willingness to pay. So the rich people, their tiniest whims overwhelm other people's needs. And then of course, endless growth is the goal. And then the rules that we have for achieving this, I'm not going to go all the rules, but in a period where our biggest challenges are like climate change and biodiversity loss and pollution of Lake Champlain, all these things that are clearly collective action problems, the rules in economics, private property rights. So how do you have private property rights to a stable climate? How do you have private property rights to clean air or to the lake? It's absolutely impossible. Our biggest challenges, they're trying to force into this framework based on private property and individual choice. I can't individually choose what level of climate stability I want or what level of, clean air or biodiversity. So we really have these rules that are wildly ill-suited to the challenges we face. And then, so I want to compare this then with ecological economics, which is my field. And again, I started this PhD in economics. Within one semester, I would have quit, except partly I got a fellowship to go spend a year and a half in Brazil, and so I didn't want to quit then. And then in Brazil, I discovered ecological economics. And this, for me, this is a way that made sense to me how the world works. And the first idea, the biophysical paradigm, is that the economy is a subsystem of our finite planet. And all the raw materials come from nature into our economy and go back to nature as waste, though some can be recycled. Energy, we have an influx of solar energy, but even today, like well over 80% of our energy is finite stocks of fossil fuels that we use to produce economic services, which gives us a flux of welfare, but the energy goes into the economy, produces something, and returns as waste. There's no recycling energy. It takes more energy to recycle energy than you get from it. So, so what we have is this biosphere generates these life support functions, often called ecosystem services, upon which we depend for our survival. So regulating the rates of atmospheric gases, the temperature, recycling nutrients, water flows, all of these things provide us with welfare, and the economy is a physical subsystem of the planetary system. Since I was born, human populations have increased from 3 billion to 8 billion. So more than doubled. Per capita consumption has actually increased about 30-fold, meaning our economy is nearly 100 times the size. Measured is how many resources we're extracting from nature and how much waste we're throwing back. Our economy has grown almost 100 times in my lifetime. And it hasn't grown into an empty void. It's grown into a finite planet, meaning it has displaced the forests and the prairies, all the ecosystems. It's spewed huge amounts of waste, which further degrades. So it's, we actually physically convert our raw materials into economic products and spew back waste. We get a bigger flux of economic benefits, because that's bigger, but a much, much smaller flux of ecological benefits we need for our survival. And just to put this in proportion, I don't know if anybody's seen this kind of literature. Anybody know what, like if you're looking at all wild terrestrial or all wild mammals, what percent of wild mammals is the biomass of humans? Just put humans on a scale on one side, all wild, it's the same thing, all wild mammals or all terrestrial vertebrates. What would you think be the relative size? 80%. That humans are 80% of it all? It's actually, so if you account for humans and our livestock, we're 96%. Humans alone outweigh all wild mammals by 10 to 1, so you're pretty close. So you said 80, it's actually about, humans are, like about 90. And so this is just a sign of like how much, this is a recent study that came out in Science, not that recent, a few years ago, but the point being that, as humanity has expanded, there is less room, less space, fewer resources for everything else. So the biophysical paradigm in ecological economics is that the economy is a part, the ecosystem is the whole, and the ecosystem provides these life support functions without which no species can survive, or very, 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 very few. And then the social paradigm is that we're not individuals, we are persons in community. We can't survive on our own. We are, we have to just accept it. It's idiotic to imagine that we're just like solitary polar bears or something. We are clearly extremely interdependent with each other. And so that you don't look at, the rational self-interested individual as your main unit of analysis. You look at the society that, and I'll explain more on that too. And then the goals, so being is we have a finite planet, and that we really, all future generations depend on. The number one goal is really ecological sustainability, and then, followed by social justice, and then followed by efficient allocation, but we define efficiency differently. We define efficiency is like, how do you get secure sufficiency for all at a minimum ecological cost? So efficiency is, benefits divided by costs, and I think with, my view, with 8 billion people, probably the best we can hope for is secure sufficiency. We all meet our basic material needs, and then our extra time can be spent interacting with each other and doing things way more fun than meeting basic needs. And then the rules are, and again, just a couple of the rules, rather than individual or private property rights, it's really common ownership of wealth created by nature and society as a whole. So if even the oil in the ground, who created that oil? It wasn't Exxon. It wasn't these oil companies. And we've given it to them, but that really should belong to all of us. And knowledge, we always look at knowledge. Oh, so look at, Amazon. They invented this way to, sell people things. So we give them private property rights. But really, Amazon without the internet would be zero. The ideas embedded in Amazon or in any of these, or Google or anything else, they were collectively created. And if you think about this, we always think about the lone genius. And we have this idea, but, Isaac Newton, when he developed, calculus, at the exact same time Leibniz did in another country, when Charles Darwin came up with natural selection, at the exact same time Wallace did on the other side of the planet, almost every single major breakthrough in science you can come up with, science had reached the point where that was going to happen. It wasn't some individual who did it. It was the collective activity of society as a whole. So this is one of the rules. Another rule is collective decision making that accounts for future generations. It can't be individual choice. It really does have to be, and we face many, many, many issues where the individual acting in their own self-interest undermines the public benefit. So as an individual, my choice to, drive a car or fly a plane, I get all the benefits, you all pay the costs. So individual choice is really bad in those circumstances. So there's some basic rules in ecological economics. Renewable resources, basic rule. You cannot extract them faster than they can regenerate, or you're going to lose them all. Waste emissions. You cannot spew waste faster than it can be absorbed, or the waste accumulates and causes worse and worse harm, which is like climate change or phosphorus in the lake or any of these things. And for non-renewable resources, if we depend on them, you can't deplete them faster than we can technologically innovate renewable substitutes. So these are kind of the rules in ecological economics that we have to meet. You have to ensure that future generations and other species have these resources. So this is just kind of the broad difference between mainstream and ecological. And my point here is they seem very different. And people have this weird idea that there's a book called The Last Man and the End of History, saying now that we have reached free market economies and liberal democracies, there's going to be no further change. And most people look at the market economy not as something we could choose, opt in or out of, but as something that is just, it's there, there's nothing we can do about it. And what I would stress is that humans, so if you think about this, 5,000 years ago, most humans lived in groups of tens to hundreds, and we were very egalitarian hunter-gatherer economies, and it tended to be in these economies, resources were really readily shared. It was a condition that either nobody went hungry or everybody went hungry. If the food was there, it was shared. Everybody recognized their mutual independence on each other, and you didn't have much in the way of private property rights. You had very shared egalitarian systems. Then we had a technological innovation of agriculture, and this allowed way higher population densities, which then required, now you needed more social hierarchies, political systems, all the stratification of society occurred as you could feed more and more people. And then they'd say that when we developed agriculture, our health went way down the tubes. So, we had way less balanced diets, so you can look at the transition. Hunter-gatherers were bigger, stronger, more robust people, and then the agriculturalists that followed were like often malnourished, more diseases, a worse life, but you could field a bigger army. So if you want to, I like living like this, and then your neighbors were agriculturalists, they could get more resources to go and take over your land. It was really hard to sustain. And then we developed, the industrial age. So here we're living on solar flows. Suddenly we figure out how to capture terrestrial stocks of energy. And the difference, a solar flow, no matter how much sunlight I use today, just as much will be there tomorrow. It comes at a rate beyond my control, but fossil fuels, we can deplete it as fast as we want. And if you think about it, if the fossil fuel age really began a couple hundred years ago, in my lifetime, I am guessing we're going to use 2/3 of all the oil we ever burn in human history just because we're burning through it so fast. We have chosen to, this unbelievable wealth of energy we discovered. A barrel of oil, it takes like 5,000 hours of human labor to do the work in a barrel of oil, assuming that we're really inefficient burning that oil. If we were efficient burning that oil, it'd take 25,000 hours of human labor to do the work in a barrel of oil. And oil at $100 a barrel, that's 25,000 hours of human labor. That's below minimum wage. So the oil is incredibly powerful, allowed us to do huge amounts of things. We could, takes energy. There's no work without energy. Suddenly we had vast amounts of incredibly dense energy that we could do huge amounts more work and also generate, of course, huge amounts more pollution. But this allowed us to develop, big cities and with all these negative ecological costs. And then we evolved, then we saw, the ideas of market economics appeared at the same time as the use of fossil fuels. And we had all these theories about how markets went into perfect balance. And then the Great Depression showed us that, gosh, our theories are wrong. They say that economists literally during the Great Depression would give talks starting out, assume full employment. Because the mainstream theory is that if there's too much supply, that drives the price down. So there's no such thing as unemployment in a perfect market economy. But with Keynes, we learned there really was. So we created all these new institutions. We created things like social safety nets, Social Security, huge amounts more government intervention stimulating the economy, a fundamental shift in our economy. And then we developed this monetary financial economy, like an intensely financialized system. And the interesting thing about money, it allows us to coordinate economic activity with people we don't even know or trust around the world. So it's this magically powerful, but also, really kind of impersonal, antisocial almost. But we developed a monetary economy. Now we really live in this information economy. Ideas can flow around the world at the speed of light, and my use not only doesn't leave less for others, it makes it better. So it's an economy based on something that improves through use, wildly different than the mainstream economy. So all of these things have evolved, but they've resulted in our rapid exploitation of the planet and really degrading the life support functions, leading to this threat of, we're exceeding the planetary boundaries, threat of catastrophe. And that's where we stand now. And what we need to do is really develop an ecological economy. And it really is, adapt or go extinct. And it's always, the idea, the market economy was around for a time, humans have been around for 300,000 years. Well over 95% of that, we lived as hunter-gatherers in a really egalitarian system. A lot of economists say that it's human nature to always want more. But if you read Darwin, you'll see that, he gave these beautiful wool blankets to Patagonian Indians, and they would love the blankets, but then they moved on, they would just leave them. They lived in a world in which they were used to making everything themselves, and if they acquired more than they could carry, if they tried to carry it, they'd die. How far could you, if you're nomadic, how far could you go carrying everything you own? So the basic idea that even this idea that we're insatiable and always want more, for most of human history, there's no empirical evidence of that. But so, we have to adapt or go extinct. And this is where I think that, the transition town movement is trying to do those adaptations. And this is what's really, really important. So now I'm going to change pace entirely for a second before I go into evolutionary issues. But I want this is a question for all of you, so I don't say anything that doesn't have some foundation. What do you think are 5 characteristics of a good person and 5 characteristics of an evil person? Or just shoot out good or evil and give a characteristic.
Empathy, good.
Empathy, good. Yeah.
Greed, bad.
Greed, bad.
Sharing is good.
Sharing is good.
Love is good.
Love is good.
Kindness is good.
Kindness is good.
Self-interest is bad.
Self-interest is bad.
Violence is bad.
Violence is bad. And it's pretty, there's already a theme here. And the theme is that a good person puts the group ahead of the individual. They're empathetic, they're sharing, they're interested in others. A bad person puts the individual ahead of themselves, ahead of the group. And that's, they're self-interested, they're violent, violence presumably to get personal gain at the cost of others. And so I actually get this exercise from a book on evolution that I had a huge impact on me. And he mentioned this, and I found that the only time, people come with the same answers you do every time I've done this, except for once, when I was asked to present to the UVM Economics Club. And the first characteristic of a good person was selfish, which was very interesting. So you can be indoctrinated. And I actually, when I did my PhD in economics, I watched my friends' moral values change in response to what we were taught in the class. So this is good versus evil. And so, Harriet Tubman, I think, quintessential good person. Hitler, quintessential evil person. Then I say, was Hitler evil? Because a good person puts the group ahead of the individual, but it doesn't say, what about other groups? If you look at World War II propaganda, what did it have to say to how we should treat Germans and Japanese? Basically, kill them all because they're animals. So the dirty little secret of the way humans behave is we put the group ahead of the individual, but if you're not part of my group, my moral values don't extend to you. And so, for a long time, this is like, we see this actually at play right now in the US. Oh, you're an immigrant, my moral values shouldn't extend to you. This is kind of what this administration is doing. But there is this thing that, and I'll make the case that, some people here probably eat meat. I eat meat sometimes. And maybe, from the perspective of all of nature, a lot of other species might think we're evil. But the point is that Hitler, by this definition, a good person puts the group ahead of the individual. In some ways, he might have been putting the group of, white, able-bodied Nazi males ahead of, ahead of his own interests. I don't know, actually. I think a lot of our leaders are actually totally narcissistic. They think they put themselves ahead of anybody else, and Machiavellian and psychopathic. Sadly, those are traits that emerge. So I wasn't really, I think there's no way you can say that Hitler was good, but I do think that we have to be aware that what defines a good person is they put the group ahead of the individual, but what's really important then is what defines the group. And so this is a precursor to when I start talking about what defines the group. So there's this idea in evolution called a major evolutionary transition. And this is when organisms that were previously able to survive on their own become so interdependent they can only survive as a collective. And so we are all eukaryotes. And a eukaryote is a cell with a nucleus. So all complex life is eukaryotic. And now we've learned actually only since the 70s. And so when I studied evolution in college, nobody even brought this up because nobody even knew that there was this a domain of life more different from us than we are from fungus, for example, called archaeans. And what they realize is that archaeans and bacteria, two wildly different domains of life, just totally unrelated, they came to cooperate so much that they merged into a eukaryotic cell in which the membrane is, from the bacteria, the membrane is from the archaeans, and the organelles are mostly from bacteria, but they became so cooperative that they could only survive collectively, and this is the last eukaryotic common ancestor. So at one point, these two things became so cooperative they could only survive collectively. And I'm comparing this, because mainstream evolutionary theory, they often say, oh, nature, red in tooth and claw, it's fierce competition. Now what we're realizing actually is that evolution is intensely based on cooperation. So you had this, this intense sort of cooperation to form a eukaryotic cell, and then eukaryotic cells originally were unicellular, but they began to cooperate. And by cooperating, it could divide, they could specialize in, different things, they could achieve way more cooperatively. So those individual cells came to cooperate as a collective. One of your cells can't survive without you. It's been another major evolutionary transition that multicellular animals have once again taken cooperation to such an extreme you can't survive without it. And then many lineages of these multicellular animals became social animals that only capable of surviving as a collective. And humans are one of those. And just as and I don't think people are really aware of how intensely interdependent we are on each other. And I mentioned, that to make clothing, was a huge accumulation of knowledge. But nobody here in this room is smart enough to master all the technologies to make this pair of glasses. It can only be made collectively. Human intelligence is distributed and collective. None of us know very much at all as individuals, but collectively we're geniuses. And so collectively, there's some of these where humans are able to do all these amazing things. Ants and other social insects cooperate. And even within, now we know that it's not just that humans collectively cooperate with each other, it's even though we have a microbiome, all animals, and they've now discovered that plants also are intensely interdependent with all these other microorganisms like types of fungus and bacteria and probably archaeans, all of these things we depend on for our survival. And what we also know is that everything cooperates to form this ecosystem in which all the parts are interdependent. And it's a basic assumption of ecological economics and widely recognized by any serious scientist that, collectively the interaction of all these different species generate this system that regulates the atmospheric gases, that cycles the nutrients, that provides all the systems we need for survival. And so, there's this idea, so that major evolutionary transitions occur, and it's led to this idea of multi-level selection, that the idea that within groups, selfish individuals outcompete cooperative individuals. So, if you're, if you're really selfish, you take from others, and others are helping you, you're going to end up, all else aside, you would seemingly do better than them. So the selfish individual who burns through all the fossil fuels, who accumulates huge amounts of wealth for themselves, they're doing better within the group. But between groups, the groups with the fewest, the groups with the most altruistic individuals outcompete other groups. So a group with a lot of altruistic individuals can do activities that through cooperation, we can have irrigation systems, we can have, even defense against others, other groups, so we have two levels of, and what we have is, so we always used to think of evolution as acting on the individual. And now what we know is evolution can act on the individual cell, but once you've undergone a major evolutionary transition, evolution is now acting on the collective group, and the same as humans transition from individuals to social. So if you think about it, a social group of humans is tied together by a culture. And for evolution to work, evolution requires three things. It needs a hereditary mechanism, and variation, and differential survival. And when Darwin came up with evolution, nobody knew about genes, and he just said these are the three things for evolution to take place. And clearly for genes, inheritance mechanism, we pass down genetic information, variation, differential survival, very clear, but the same is equally true for culture. We acquire our culture from the society we're born into and from our families. One difference is that culture can also have what they call vertical transmission of ideas. We can pick up ideas from another culture. You don't have to wait for the genes. So you have, so humans, where others, actually I think I might have a thing there for that. Oh, I'll get back to that in a second. But the basic point being, selfishness at one scale reduces fitness at higher scales. So a selfish cell is a cancer. It takes all the resources for itself, it destroys your well-being. A selfish individual is a psychopath, only thinks about themselves, doesn't care about the rest of society. And I would argue a selfish species is a plague that just takes down the whole ecosystem. And that any culture that evolved to where it was focused primarily on its own well-being and not caring about the natural system into which it evolved would exploit that natural system, wipe out the resources it required to survive, and go extinct. So natural selection would act in favor of those groups who saw themselves with deep connections to nature. And the other point, this is the point I started to make and got distracted, is that in humans, our evolution is now cultural. 300,000 years ago, we reached the genetic state of Homo sapiens. And we lived, in little communities in Africa. Since then, we have dominated the whole planet, and that's been through cultural evolution. So there is more variation between cultures than within cultures. So if you look at, a culture of Inuit and a culture of Wall Street executives, there's way more variation between those two cultures than there is within them. And clearly, natural selection is acting on the group. It's the group of Inuit. No Inuit can survive on their own. Natural selection acts on the group. And if differential survival, if you threw some Wall Street execs north of the Arctic Circle, they're dead in days. And if you throw some Inuit into Manhattan, they're not going to thrive either. So this is the real world we face, a system in which a driving force of evolutionary history has been cooperation at larger and larger scales, allows us to solve more and more problems and to thrive and survive. And so that's where I want to come at it. And then, so what we need is, there's this economics and levels of selection. So the other point I want to make, though, is that natural selection still does act at both scales. There are times we behave selfishly, and when we do so, and I pay for my kids to go to college, and that's selfish. I mean, I could, I let my son go anywhere he wanted. I could have paid a bunch of other people to go to a cheaper school, but I'm selfish when it comes to some things. All of us are, but we're also, so natural selection favors selfishness within the group, favors cooperation between groups. Both types of selection can happen at the same time, which is why this theory is called multi-level selection theory. So it acts at different levels. And then what that relates to economics is we have our mainstream microeconomics. It's focused on markets and individual self-interest. It's all about, it's the egocentric, really focused on the selfish individual. And, as I say, there are times all of us have to behave selfishly at times, and you do need some institutions that respond to that. Unfortunately, that's primarily what we have. Then you have macroeconomics, and this governments and public purpose sphere. This is really focused on the collective interest, the public interest. I say here anthropocentric, which means putting humans first, but in a way you probably should say sociocentric. We put our society first. Most of us, most people in the United States wouldn't say, let's extend all our, welfare and Social Security, all the things we have to other countries and share the wealth globally. We tend to think, in terms of our nation. So you could say, instead of anthropocentric, we could say sociocentric. But the classic thing is ask not what your country can do for you, ask rather what you can do for your country. And so we have these two types of economic systems in huge conflict. Right now, we have one, a government really focused on, let's focus on the selfish individuals. And what we really need, ecological economics, is, first of all, I have question marks here saying, what are the institutions? And I'll talk about that in a second. But the focus of ecological economics is the relationship between humans and the rest of nature. So it really is ecocentric. It's trying to say we do need a way of recognizing that nature provides us with all these life support functions, and we need to ensure that nature is capable of doing that into the future. And this is the goal of ecological economics. And the basic principle is the relation between humans and the rest of nature should be the same as between one of your cells and your body. So, if you think about a cell in your body, how do you want it to behave towards you? Do you want that selfish cell that's saying, oh, no, I'm in it for me? No, you want a cell that is going to, its sole purpose really is to ensure your survival. And that to do that, it does have to take care of itself. Your cell has to feed itself and support the waste, but its main goal is to take care of you. There's this idea in ecological economics that talk a lot about ecosystem services, which is defined as nature's benefits to people. And I think that that's absolutely idiotic. I think that would be like saying, if I was looking at one of my cells, ecosystem services, just looking at ecosystem services, what are Josh's benefits to me? You don't want your cell thinking that way. You want your cell prioritizing the whole over the part. So ecosystem services in my mind should not be nature's benefits to people, but nature's benefits to the biotic system of which humans are a part. And so you want so as it should be that relation of the cell to the body. We should be focused on taking care of the whole system, and if we don't, we're dead, just as like a cancerous cell is going to kill you. So I have a student from South Africa who actually just turned into comp questions and gave a presentation on one of her papers today, and I was thinking, damn it, Liza, I should have just had you come present here instead of me, because this is stuff you're thinking about more and you know more about. And she comes from a culture that's based on the ethic of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu means I am because we are. So the fact that I exist as a human is only because all of you also exist, and only collectively am I human. And there's this territories of life is a very similar idea. There's a group called Sakata that has developed this idea of territories of life, and these are the territories around the planet that have been managed under indigenous principles for millennia, and they contain an inordinate percentage of global biodiversity and carbon stocks. In other words, people have been managing this land in a way that preserves the ecological functions. And my view on this, people always talk about, indigenous wisdom. My view on it is that cultures that did not preserve the health of their ecosystems just went extinct. So any culture that's been around for 5,000 years has been around that long because they recognized that they had to pay attention to their relationship with nature. And so and so the territories of life, it's these territories that have been managed effectively, but the management principles are remarkably similar to Ubuntu. And these are, around, so Ubuntu is primarily in Africa. I don't know if anybody here has read Serviceberry or Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it's really expressing a lot of these same ideas. And I love the fact that in Serviceberry, she explicitly says this is ecological economics. And she's coming at it, from a millennial, long tradition before. But it really is focusing on the interconnectedness of humans with society and nature. I am because we are, but also we are because all of nature is. It's like, and it really is collectivism over individualism. It's recognizing we're together. And it's this idea of reciprocity as natural law. And this is the way many cultures have thought about nature, is that it showers us with these gifts that we absolutely depend upon for our survival, and it's our obligation to reciprocate and do what we can to sustain nature. And this is, like we sustain ourselves and ourselves reciprocate by sustaining our bodies, but this is really important. I have a friend who's worked with the Cree for like over 40 years, and he had some subtle nuances about this, but what I interpreted what he was saying is that for the Cree, this idea of reciprocity is what, ontological. It's a fundamental fact about the way things are. That nature and humans and society, it's all about reciprocity, and not to reciprocate would just be considered so bizarre in their culture. It would just be like, it would be, something wild. So, the core values, this was somebody talking about the core values of Ubuntu, but it also applies to territories of life. It's relationality. We're all in relation to each other, collective responsibility, communal accountability, social justice, recognition, reciprocity. And the way I like to think of this is that we have to understand the world and the universe as a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And that's the ethos of the Ecozoic, which is our group is called the Leadership of the Ecozoic. But anyway, so now I want to just say what this means, though. How do you apply this? What's this mean in reality? What's it mean to all of you? So we put together a project on urban agroecology, and there's this huge debate in agriculture called the sparing and sharing debate. So the people who say sparing, we should have really intensive, high chemical, high industrialized agriculture on small amounts of land to spare more land for conservation. And the sharing is, let's manage our agricultural land in a way that also generates tons of ecological benefits. There's this huge debate. We're bypassing that debate. We're saying, let's take land that's useless. It's not doing anything. It's not producing ecological benefits or food. And this is one of the lawns we did last year. And we'll convert it. So we took this, we like sheet mulched it, planted squash on it. The squash and watermelons we got 300 pounds of squash from this lawn, maybe a dozen watermelons. You can see here the squash, and all of this extra food. So we convert people's lawns on the condition that, so first of all, we're asking people to manage their lawns not for their own selfish interest. We're asking them to manage the land for the good of society and the rest of nature. And we said, we'll plant your stuff. You have the condition, you have to share any surplus food, any food you have, ideally you eat it with family and friends. Get this together of like, eating together, but any surplus has to be donated to those who need it. And one of my former grad students, who's now a colleague, set up Food Not Bombs in Burlington, and we give them the surplus production. So we gave them like 300 pounds of stuff last year. And then in the spring, so after doing all this, we sheet mulched, killed all the grass, and then we threw in wildflower seeds. So now these lawns are, really meeting the benefits of nature. So instead of focusing on the lawn as my personal property to manage, it's to manage for the collective good and to share. And these are just, this is just pictures of my lawn, which is like all food production, grows huge amounts of food. I thought it was funny, this year I had kids coming and taking a lot of the food, and I was like, no, not until it's ripe. I didn't tell them they couldn't take the food, I just said you can't take it green and waste it. Because one of the goals here is just to share the food, and there's so much obscene quantities of food that it's wonderful to share. And some of these are like native species, Jerusalem artichoke, and then other lawns we did were, and so the surplus food, I wanted to have a picture here of the 300 pounds of squash we donated, but I couldn't find it because I'm terribly organized. But so so this is the Food Not Bombs, or Food Not Cops, they often call it, organized by one of my grad students, who when all these academics were saying, COVID's here, we got to study hunger, and he was saying, no, COVID's here, we got to feed people. So for over 5 years now, he has been, is it over 5 years? But he's been feeding people every single day. And they do a lot of dumpster diving. This just shows, this is a dumpster outside of a store with just hundreds of pounds of perfectly good food. So he started out, he does dumpster diving, grows his own, a lot of food from their own, and but the basic idea is that we're trying to get people to use their lawns for the good of the community and not just for their own thing. In Burlington, yeah. And we want to go bigger, but we're starting out, and we're actually, there's evidence of viral spread. Once some people, the first lawns we did, all their neighbors said, oh, can we do ours? And actually I want to leave time for questions, but so I'll try to go through this quick. But so one of the things I wanted to point about is economists are all focused on efficiency. And so I really wanted to quickly look at the difference of markets, efficiency of markets versus gifting. And so I did a big study, econometric study, quantitative, in which on this axis it shows per capita expenditures for different countries. So, poor countries have very low expenditures. As you get richer and richer and richer, they spend more and more. And this blue tells you how much food people consume relative to their income. So people in poor countries like Eritrea is way down here, and people, in the U.S. is way out here. And as people get richer, they consume more and more food, which we all know. But what I wanted to look at, what happens when the price of food goes up? So in a market economy, when the price of food goes up, so for example, 2008 to 2000, or 2007, 2008, 2011, 2012, price of wheat more than doubled. How many of you ate less bread? And how many of you noticed that the prices had more than doubled for grain? We didn't even notice. It's an insignificant part of our budget. And so when the prices went way up, this tells us how much we reduced food consumption. Poor people slashed food consumption. It's by number of calories, 1% increase in the price of food led to this big a decrease in consumption. And actually, I should have put a better graph on this, but the basic idea is poor people slash consumption as the price of food goes up. Rich people don't even notice. And so markets, what they do is they're actually allocating the marginal unit of food to the people who need it least. And in my view, that's just wildly inefficient. I couldn't think of a more inefficient way to do it. And I'd have way more to say on this if I didn't have, but I wanted to look really quickly at reciprocity and gift economies. And as I said before, for most of human history, we lived in communities where no one starved unless everyone starved. And eating alone was considered sociopathic. If you ate by yourself, there was something fundamentally wrong with you. It was the chance you had, it was one of the only times you could hoard stuff for yourself, and that was so looked down upon, you would often be ostracized from the community and might even, basically put to death if you did that. And what happened is, somebody would go out and get an elk and come back with an elk, and that's a huge amount of food. And more than they could possibly eat. It'd be a huge amount of effort to preserve and salt and take care of that. So what they would do is the person who comes back with that surplus of food would give it to the people who didn't have enough. And those who didn't have enough, who couldn't meet their basic, they were hungry that day, the value of that food was immeasurably large. My kids might die if I don't get it. There's nothing, what could be more important? The value to the person who gave it to them, who had an excess, was tiny, was immeasurably small. I started out with that picture of squash, of my backyard actually with squash. I grew 360 pounds of squash 2 years ago. And it was like, what was the marginal value of squash to me? Almost nothing. What was the value to all my friends and neighbors who I gave, tons of squash? They loved it because they didn't have any good organic squash. And so it's, so we're transferring resources from those who have too much to those who don't have enough. And each economic transaction, so I give this stuff to my neighbors and they think, oh man, it's a human nature. We want to reciprocate. Somebody does something nice to you, you want to do something nice to them. And so you do something, and for me, it wasn't even that nice. I just did way too much squash. I'm going to rot. So, but they interpreted it as something really, really nice, and then they make a big effort to do something very nice for me. And this is the way those economies work. And each economic transaction is strengthening social ties. Somebody gave me something really, really nice. I think in my head, how do I compensate? How do I do the same? And that's what people do. I never feel like writing a thank you note when I go to Hannaford's. I don't. In fact, if I get something really cheap, I'm happy about it. And so this is just a few more. This is some other lawns we did. This year, people did not want, most of the people didn't want food. We did plant a lot of food, but they didn't want the squash vines everywhere, so we just did the converting to wildflowers. So we planted this in the spring, and this is what it looked like in August. And we're trying to figure out the cheap, easy ways to convert lawns, because we want to figure out how anybody can do this. And this is another one we did that was a little, it takes a couple of years. Sometimes people have these expectations. So these were annuals that came up. These are perennials. They're going to look nice next year. So it takes a couple of years. We have to make sure people know what they're getting into. And we're still trying to figure this all out. We experimented with a lot of different ways to convert lawns, and I think we're getting much better at it. And the goal, though, is, we're not looking at technological solutions. We want to change cultural values. And I think that food was probably the last thing to be removed from social exchange and forced into the economy. It's been, food has been a shared thing for so long, and perhaps the best thing to take out of the market economy. But there's a social dilemma is a situation in which if I act in my own greedy self-interest, I do better, but society does worst. This is why we evolved cooperation, to deal with those problems. And this is a paraphrase of a quote from the most widely cited paper in environmental economics, in environmental science, Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. And it starts out with this. It says, social dilemmas have no technical solution. They require a fundamental extension of morality. And the reason I asked, what's a good person, what's a bad person in the beginning, that's about morality. Anthropologists have gone and found the most universal moral principle across all the cultures they studied is a good person puts the group ahead of the individual. And so what we want to do is change the nature of the group. A fundamental extension of morality is redefining group. And so with our lawns, first of all, we're trying to change the relationship to land, society, and nature. We want people to define, instead of focusing on the lawn as their own, that they own, instead they're stewards of it and managing it for the benefits of society in the future. But what I see our challenge is extending morality to the rest of humanity and the rest of nature. And this is the challenge we face, but I also would argue the evolutionary history shows this has been the progression. Since humans first evolved, what we have done is systematically expanded the size of the group to larger and larger scales. So 5,000 years ago, the biggest city in the world was the size of Burlington. And that was the biggest collective group we could have. And, and since then, we have now expanded our definition of group to vastly larger scales. And, one of the things that one of the things that actually separates us is a lot of people who don't like Trump's attitudes towards migrants is because our definition of group includes migrants. His definition doesn't. And we're trying to expand our definition, but what we really need to do then is expand our definition of the group to encompass all of nature, because if we fail to reciprocate for all the gifts that nature bestows upon us, we're going to destroy that system and to the detriment of all. So those were, and I'm sorry, I probably talked longer than I should have, but yeah. So yeah, and I'm happy for, and I do have like another 50 slides, but I'm not going to go anywhere there. But happy to have any questions, any conversation, and I also, totally, I'm a huge believer that science only progresses when we poke holes in it and figure out how to make it better. So I always tell my students that they have to test what I tell them, against reality. So if what I teach doesn't help you understand reality, it's useless. And if it is contradicted by a reality, it's wrong. And it's all of your jobs to figure out the flaws.
Two quick things.
Hold on.
Talking to the microphone.
Okay.
That's so we can hear it on the
Okay. I feel like another progression might be food forests. My son lives in a town where they have two, and it's pretty amazing.
I totally forgot to show, I meant to put it up there. We did plant a food forest, a community food forest last year, but this coming year, it's at the Hort Farm, UVM Hort Farm. We planted hundreds and hundreds of species. It's a little bit on a shady area, but it will be producing a lot of food, which is for the community. So yes.
Fantastic. Other thing, is there a place or a website to find out more about the lawn replacement kind of things that you're doing?
Basically, I have way too much work to do. So the way I did this project is doing it as a course, and we have drafted a website, have a lot of the stuff up. There is a website, but it's not even worth recommending people to yet because it's too stripped down. So that's one of our goals, is we really want to provide all the resources anybody needs to convert their lawn, how to do it, why to do it, and other thing I forgot to mention, partly because I've been inundated with my grad students doing stuff, is also should talk about the homegrown national parks. I don't know if people have heard of that. It's a movement started by this guy, Doug Ptolemy, to get everybody to plant their lawns in native ecosystems. It would double the size of our national, we have twice as much lawn as we do national park in the US. Other thing I totally forgot to put up there, I was kind of rushing to do this, is for food production, the largest crop in America, the largest irrigated crop is lawns, is grass. And so during World War II, we grew half of our fruits and vegetables in people's lawns. So, and so partly, I titled this proposal Urban Agroecology. We're going to supply for more funding, but now the new funding is going to be Victory Gardens for Homeland Security. So. Yeah, so you reminded me of things I forgot to put up. Yeah.
Hi, Josh. I'm wondering if you're familiar with, there's this podcast, Future Ecologies, and there was a guy on there called Dave.
Hold the microphone closer.
Sure. His name's Adam Davis, and he started a business called Ecosystem Investment Partners, which he describes as like a part of a restoration economy. And I can't remember the idea exactly, but it was a very interesting podcast. But it was around conservation, making conserving land profitable. It was related to how companies need to like mitigate. It's like an offset kind of thing, where it's like, oh, if I'm causing this damage, I need to mitigate that. I wish I could describe it better because it was.
I know very much the general
I'm
idea.
wondering what you know about that. And
There's tons of efforts like this, and I look at, so I was at the conference of the parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity a few years back in Montreal, and right after it, the Global Environmental Facility, the World Bank thing says, we need to come up with ways to conserve nature that make lots of profits for the financial sector. And I'm like, no. The idea that you would be siphoning off resources for rich people in order to save nature, I actually find kind of despicable and kind of the exact opposite. So I actually think we need to extend our morality to that, and they're trying to come up with principles based on the selfish individual. And so 2 years ago, working with some anthropologists from McGill, we put together a big proposal that said, instead of, for these territories of life that have preserved most of the biodiversity and most of the carbon, instead of trying to use our economic institutions imposing on them to try to get them to do what they've already been doing, our goal was, why don't we work with them to find out what kind of mechanisms would enable them to keep doing it? And so really changing this idea around. But there's thousands of these proposals where, like, you can invest in nature and make a big profit doing it. And I've seen so many kinds of things calling for that. But in my view, I think our financial system is totally screwed up. But I got to say, I am fundamentally opposed to the logic behind that, which encourages the self-interest that undermines the collective good, in my view.
It smells funny.
Yeah, it smells really funny. And I could give you tons of examples. And one of the groups we were going to work with was the indigenous group from Panama. His name is slipping my mind. And they were part of RED, and they said, "What? This is not, this is just crazy." And it's a lot of these groups were reciprocity. So there's a long history of interaction with indigenous groups where they would go in, and say, the Cree will give Hydro-Quebec the right to build dams. But in their mind, this is a reciprocity thing. We're doing something nice for you. You should therefore do something nice for us, starting a mutually beneficial relationship. And instead it was seen as within the market framework, let's give them as little as possible to get as much as we can. And it's so out of sync with the economic systems that led to the conservation. And now we're trying to, impose our models on them, because our models seem to work pretty poorly, for the goal of conservation. And good question, though.
Can I just talk into it? Yes. Okay. Hi. My husband and I have spent the last 3 years, we're trying to build a food forest on our half-acre plot in suburbia. And as you're talking, what I think we're missing is this community part of it. We're doing it ourselves. We want to have food that we can then share, but it feels like within the neighborhood, it's just us, and we're looked at as kind of, it's people are interested, but nobody else is taking part. And I don't know, I guess I'm feeling like maybe we're missing a community piece to what we're doing. And I just wondered if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, so one thing is, I was kind of the first person in my neighborhood to do it. And I loved it when a friend who hadn't come by my house in a long time came to visit, and he stopped in front of the wrong house because it was another house who had completely converted their lawn. And even my neighbors, so I give them all the time all this food, but then they want to reciprocate. So one of a shared friend of Irene, Carmel today, brought me by a loaf of bread because I always give her, the garden stuff, and she always gives me bread. And it does build this, which I think is very part of a transition town. And they also, her husband will say, "Don't buy those tools, I have those tools." And we're really sharing a lot of things. And I remember fixing my bike in my driveway and hearing somebody go by and say, "Look at all the weeds in that lawn." And actually there were hundreds of pounds of food, lots of wildflowers, and I was thinking, God, and so I would have these, kind of derisive comments about it, and now everybody's going by and saying, "Wow, look at all that food." And so I have seen a change in the years since I've been doing it. And honestly, I did decide to try to make it, I like messiness, I like nature, and I just wanted the, whatever comes and thrives, let it do it. This time I tried to make it a little more tidy, you know, a tidy border around the messy nature, and people do seem to prefer that. Not me personally, but.
I would too, as someone who has seen your garden.
Yeah. But you see it now, the front yard anyway is more food than ever, but tidier looking.
I have a question. The Jericho Underhill Food Hub has sharing sheds, and it's a great concept, very popular, but it's all anonymous.
Yeah.
So people who have the extra come by, drop off at the shed. People who like to have some food come by when they can and pick up what's available.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, with the reciprocity, is it the model should be changed so that we can identify those who have given and identify those who have taken, and so that people can make more of a community out of it versus just an anonymous place to drop your food, an anonymous place to pick it up?
That's a great question. So, you know, I'm working on a paper with my grad students right now, trying to figure out how do we extend. So when people lived in these small bands and shared all the food, they knew each other. And you know, they say that about a human brain is capable of tracking about 200 different people to know whether they would cooperate or defect in, you know, whether they would help you if you help them. And that's about all we can handle is about 200. And now we're trying to figure out how we would make a way to have food free for everybody, but have people experience is like something for which they should reciprocate. And so I think that's an excellent question, and I don't have a good answer to that. My grad student, Sam Bliss, who's been running the Food Not Bombs, he lives on Hungerford Terrace. They refer to their place as the Hunger Fort. And there's a place there, there's fridges and places to donate food, and anybody who wants can come take the food, and any food that doesn't get taken gets then processed and prepared to feed the homeless, or to feed anybody who wants, actually. You can actually look at Food Not Cops on Yelp. It's mostly people give it a 5 stars. It's free food. Anybody who wants it at noon mostly gets 5 stars, but a couple of people don't like the concept and have given it a 1 star. But that's a really good question, and one struggling to figure out.
I will say we lived in a different community about 5 years ago, and we would have during the summer, we would set up a table in front of the town library in Wells River, and people could bring in their excess produce and then take away what they wanted. And people were very loath in public to take away food.
Oh, really?
And we really encouraged it. We would talk about how all of this food's going to go to waste if you don't take it. Please, you know, we'll share it. And so it became something where it wasn't because you were poor or didn't need enough. Everybody got to share. Yeah. But it was a hard slog at first. Yeah. People were loath to do that.
So with my students, we're working on this idea of how to remove food from the market, and we did a study. It's called a linear programming model, and we figured out that you could feed everybody in the U.S. an ecologically and physiologically healthy diet, and it would cost 1.2% of our GDP. And 1.2% of our GDP is the amount of GDP growth we've had in the last 6 months. So what we would need to do to end hunger in America is accept our living standards from 6 months ago plus free food. But what we want to do is, instead of this idea, and it'd be SNAP for all, we looked at everything we are talking about already has existing policies in place. And the idea here that brought it up because of stigma is because a lot of people feel like food stamps have a stigma right now. That if you're on food stamps, well, we would like to switch that stigma. So the idea would be that you would have access to an ecologically and physiologically healthy diet for free. But you'd still have markets and every other kind of food. But the idea was now, if you're buying the other food, you're not living off the free food, well, then you're degrading the environment and taking what belongs to me. You know, the clean air, the clean atmosphere, and the stigma would then be on those who don't get the free food, because they're imposing higher ecological costs on all of us. So whether or not you can do that, I don't know. That's the goal.
Well, thanks so much, Josh. We gotta call it a night.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you.